In this episode, we take the findings from an assessment report and turn them into decisions, because discovering risk is only half the job in governance work. The other half is deciding what to do about that risk in a way that is deliberate, consistent, and accountable. Risk responses are the structured choices an organization makes when it faces uncertainty and potential harm. And the classic set you will hear includes avoid, accept, share, mitigate, and transfer. These words get thrown around casually, but using them correctly matters because they imply different actions, different responsibilities, and different outcomes. Beginners often think risk response is just choosing the one that sounds safest, but in real governance, the correct response depends on context, requirements, feasibility, and the organization's tolerance for residual risk. The goal is not to eliminate all risk, because that is impossible, but to manage risk in a way that supports mission and business goals while meeting obligations. When you can assign risk responses properly, you help the organization move from a list of problems to a plan of action. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at CGRC.Me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. To get started, it helps to define risk in a way that makes response choices clearer. Risk is the possibility that an event or condition will cause harm, and in cybersecurity governance, harm often includes data exposure, service disruption, financial loss, legal consequences, or loss of trust. A risk response is not the same as a control, because a control is a mechanism used to reduce risk, while a response is the decision about how to handle the risk overall. Another beginner confusion is mixing risk with a vulnerability, but a vulnerability is a weakness, while risk is the effect of that weakness in a real context. For example, a missing patch is a vulnerability, but the risk depends on whether the system is exposed, what data it holds, and what compensating controls exist. When you assign a response, you are deciding how the organization will address the risk, not just how it will fix a single technical issue. This is also why responses often involve business leaders, because risk decisions connect to mission priorities and resource trade-offs. A correct response is one that matches the reality of the risk and the organization's constraints. Mitigation is the risk response most people default to because it feels like the responsible choice, but it has a specific meaning. To mitigate risk is to reduce the likelihood of the risk event, reduce the impact if it occurs, or both, by implementing or improving controls. Mitigation can be technical, like strengthening authentication, improving segmentation, or enhancing logging. But it can also be procedural, like tightening change control, improving training, or clarifying roles. The key is that mitigation does not mean fixing everything immediately. It means taking actions that measurably reduce risk relative to the requirement and the organization's priorities. Mitigation also has a cost, whether in money, time, complexity, or operational friction, and those costs should be considered openly. A common misconception is that mitigation must drive risk to zero, but mitigation often results in residual risk, meaning some risk remains even after controls improve. Good mitigation decisions specify what will be done, who will do it, when it will be done, and how effectiveness will be verified. Without those elements, mitigation becomes a vague promise instead of a risk response. Risk acceptance is another response that is widely misunderstood, because it can sound like doing nothing, and that makes people uneasy. Accepting risk means the organization consciously decides not to take additional action beyond current controls, because the risk is within tolerance, or because the cost and disruption of additional controls outweigh the benefit. Acceptance is not denial, and it is not ignoring a problem. It is a documented decision that the remaining risk is acceptable for a defined period and under defined conditions. A correct risk acceptance usually includes a rationale, an owner, and sometimes monitoring requirements or review dates. Acceptance is also often bounded by requirements, because some risks cannot be accepted if they involve mandatory obligations that must be met. For example, if a requirement is legally binding, acceptance may not be an option unless a formal exception process exists and is allowed. A beginner mistake is to accept risk simply because it is inconvenient to fix, without analyzing impact and likelihood. Another mistake is to accept risk forever, which can turn acceptance into negligence. Proper acceptance is a controlled decision that acknowledges residual risk and keeps accountability intact. Risk avoidance is a response that sounds dramatic, but it is sometimes the most straightforward option. Avoiding risk means changing plans so the risky activity no longer occurs, which removes the exposure rather than trying to control it. This could mean discontinuing a system, turning off a feature, refusing a certain type of data processing, or changing a business process so the vulnerable path no longer exists. Avoidance is often appropriate when the risk is high and cannot be reduced to an acceptable level with reasonable controls, or when the activity is not essential. A misconception is that avoidance is always too expensive, but sometimes it is cheaper than ongoing mitigation, especially if mitigation would require complex redesign and continuous maintenance. Avoidance can also be required when a system cannot meet mandatory requirements and no acceptable exception exists. The trade-off is that avoiding risk often removes capability, which can affect business goals and user experience. A correct avoidance decision should clearly state what will stop, what alternative will be used, and how the organization will ensure the risk exposure is actually removed. Avoidance is not a slogan. It is an operational change that must be verified. Risk transfer and risk sharing are closely related and are frequently confused, so it is worth being precise. Transfer is the idea that you move some portion of the financial impact of a risk to another party, often through mechanisms like insurance or contractual arrangements. Sharing is broader and means distributing risk across parties, such as using a third-party service where responsibilities are divided or partnering so that risk is managed jointly. In both cases, the key beginner lesson is that you cannot transfer accountability for requirements that remain yours. You can transfer financial loss, and you can outsource operations, but you cannot outsource responsibility for protecting data and meeting obligations. A common misunderstanding is to think that buying insurance eliminates risk, but insurance typically addresses costs after an event, not the event itself. Another misunderstanding is to assume that a vendor takes all risk because they host a system, when in reality responsibilities are shared and must be clarified. Correct use of transfer and sharing includes reviewing contracts, service commitments, and assurance evidence, and it includes confirming that the chosen partner can actually manage the risk. If you share or transfer without verifying capability and responsibilities, you may end up with the same risk plus a new dependency risk. One useful way to assign the correct response is to start from the assessment finding and separate the problem into what is mandatory and what is flexible. If a requirement must be met, the response options may be limited to mitigation or avoidance, unless a formal exception or variance process exists. If a requirement is internal and policy-based, there may be more flexibility, but the organization still needs to decide how much risk it is willing to tolerate. You then consider likelihood and impact, which helps you see whether the risk is a small irritation or a serious threat to mission. Next, you consider feasibility, meaning what it would take to mitigate and whether mitigation is practical within time and resources. If mitigation is feasible and produces meaningful risk reduction, it may be the right response. If mitigation is not feasible or would cripple the business process, you look at avoidance, or you consider whether acceptance is justified with strong rationale and monitoring. If the risk is about potential financial loss, you might add transfer through insurance, but you still need controls to reduce the chance of loss. This structured thinking prevents response selection from being purely emotional or political. Another important aspect of correct risk response assignment is recognizing that responses can be combined, but they must still be described clearly. An organization might mitigate by improving controls, transfer some financial impact through insurance, and still accept a small amount of residual risk because no control eliminates all uncertainty. That combination is normal and often healthy, but it becomes confusing if people label everything as transfer or everything as accept without specificity. Correct labeling matters because each response implies different follow-up actions and different monitoring needs. Mitigation requires implementation and validation. Acceptance requires documentation, ownership, and review. Transfer requires confirming coverage and understanding exclusions. Sharing requires clear responsibility boundaries and ongoing vendor oversight. If you label a response incorrectly, you can easily skip the follow-up steps that make it real. For example, calling something transferred might lead people to ignore control improvement, which is dangerous because insurance does not prevent incidents. Correct assignment is not only about picking a word, it is about selecting the right governance pathway. Accountability is also a core part of correct risk response assignment, because risk decisions must have owners. If a risk is accepted, who accepts it, and do they have the authority to do so? If a risk is mitigated, who is responsible for the remediation actions and for proving they are effective? If a risk is avoided, who approves the business change and who verifies it actually happened? If a risk is shared with a vendor, who manages that vendor relationship and who reviews assurance evidence? A beginner mistake is to assign responses without naming owners, which leads to orphaned risks that sit in a report until the next assessment finds them again. Correct risk response assignment ties the response to a person or role, a timeline, and a method of verification. It also clarifies escalation, meaning what happens if the response is not executed on time or if the risk changes. Accountability keeps the risk response from being an abstract decision and turns it into a managed activity. It is also important to talk about residual risk, because every response leaves something behind unless you truly avoid the activity entirely. Residual risk is the risk that remains after controls and response actions are in place, and it is what leaders actually live with. Correct risk response assignment should include an understanding of what residual risk will remain and whether that residual risk is acceptable. Mitigation should reduce residual risk, but it rarely eliminates it, and sometimes mitigation introduces new risk, such as complexity risk or operational fragility. Transfer can change who pays for damage, but residual operational risk remains, and reputational risk may remain as well. Acceptance is essentially declaring residual risk acceptable, but it should be reviewed because the environment and threat landscape can change. When you incorporate residual risk thinking, you avoid the illusion that a response is a clean ending. Instead, you treat risk management as continuous, which is realistic and aligned with governance. This mindset also supports prioritization, because some mitigations produce large reductions in residual risk, while others produce small reductions and may not be worth the cost. By the end of this topic, you should be able to use the 5 classic risk responses with precision and assign them in a way that makes sense for the evidence and the requirements. Mitigate means reduce likelihood or impact through controls and prove the improvement works. Accept means document a conscious decision that residual risk is within tolerance, with ownership and review. Avoid means change plans so the risky activity no longer occurs, removing exposure. Share and transfer mean distribute aspects of risk across parties, often including financial impact, while keeping accountability for obligations and ensuring responsibilities are clear. Assigning these correctly is not about picking the safest sounding word. It is about making a defensible decision path that can be executed and monitored. When assessments flow into correct risk responses, the organization moves from knowing about problems to managing them intelligently. And that is the purpose of governance work in the first place.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.